So here they come. So I'm going to give a bit of background now on the My Theology series. It's a new series of pocket-sized books in which the world's leading Christian thinkers explain some of the principal tenets of their theological beliefs. Basically, the idea was to find a suitable format for making theology more accessible to a wider readership without necessarily dumbing it down. We think that if theology is seeking of understanding of God and of faith, then we felt that the content in the series should be something that everyone can appreciate. So the series aims to make something that can be bought, read and understood by everybody, really. We hope the series itself reflects a proper diversity of perspectives and experience. You'll hear that tonight, I think, and to help demonstrate that theology is a really diverse discipline, and that it can be approached in different ways. Without further ado, I am going to hand over to Virginia, and we will get underway. So, to go, Virginia, over to you.
Good evening. It's really lovely to be here again, and really lovely to be with Anne and Rachel, and thank goodness technology is all sorted tonight, because this one's been postponed since before Christmas, so it's really lovely to finally get around to actually doing it. So this is the fourth event in the series, and each one I kicked off with the same question for both speakers, and I'm going to start and ask the question of you, Anne, and then I'll go to Rachel. And really, it's really interesting to, I think, to all of us to understand a little bit about your theological formations. So can you tell us a little about your journey to who you are today and how your theology was formed and who was influential in that?
I was fortunate in a sense that I was at the right age to change schools from my first school to my second school, that grammar school places for girls were open in a way that they hadn't been before. I mean, you had to pass an entrance exam, but at least I got a place in one of them. And that meant, first of all, that I was going to be taught by graduates. And of course, most of us then were first time, students doing fairly serious academic work even at school. And we had some excellent teaching, excellent and inspiring teaching. And we learned also, of course, very quickly that you didn't actually have to pitch yourself out into the workplace at the age of 16, that there were other possibilities for education a little bit further on. If you wanted to apply for university, you have to remember that, thank God, in those days, the UK was like the rest of Europe and most of the rest of the world in not charging tuition fees. So you weren't going to be clobbered financially by the prospect of going to university. And one person at the university was particularly influential, a lady called Miss Pestle, who had two brothers who were ordained Anglicans from Durham, and she'd obviously spent some time in Durham. And she looked after those of us who were doing A-level scripture, as it then was, very well. And she used to scoop us up and take us to meetings in Manchester, long trips on the bus. And one of those in particular was very important to me, as I realized later on. Trevor Huddleston, Not For Your Comfort, had just been published. And Trevor was doing the rounds, publicizing, what was going on in South Africa. And so, and how deadly it was, literally deadly in some cases. And so you very quickly got a sense that there was something here that was really very important in people's lives and societies and the way they were organized. So that was very helpful, I think, lifelong. I got a place at Durham, and like I think most universities then, this is pre the expansion of the universities, as a result of the Robbins report in the 1960s. They were very small. I mean, Durham was about 1,100 students or something like that at the time. So we could all walk around and meet one another and exchange views and perspectives. And as far as the department was concerned, we had three very exceptional people who were very important to me particularly. One of them was Kingsley Barrett, great Methodist biblical exegete. Another was Charles Cranfield, who was, the paramount commentator, I think, on biblical texts. I mean, he was a classicist and could tackle things in a way that other people couldn't. And Charles had opted to be a military chaplain during the war, and one way or another, it somehow or other filtered through to us that there were things of great, really serious matters at stake in theology. If you'd seen at first hand what had happened to the German churches insofar as they committed themselves to, the German Christian movement. And then, so that was another bit of reinforcement, if you like, that theology really did matter socially and politically. And then the third person was the person who became my personal tutor, Alec Whitehouse, who was a mathematician, who became a theologian and a Congregationalist minister, and it had a lot to do with the opponents of the German Christian movement, both before the war and then during the war, when they were refugees and got as far as the UK, and then afterwards. And the important thing about them for later life, I think, was they were all three non-conformists, and none of them have the hang-ups about women doing theology and possibly being ordained that all too many members of the Church of England had, and I think still have. So I think that would be the ready sketch of it. Alec was one of the people who disappeared about the same time as Ninian Smart went to Lancaster to found the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Kent. So they were a pretty remarkable group, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really lovely to hear those connections and the idea that theology is important and the people you met made theology important to you. So Rachel, can I ask you, what was your theological formation like? What was important to you in coming to be a theologian? Because I think it's quite a different path from Anne's.
Yeah, absolutely. Although there's a blast from the past, Anne, Ninian Smart. I was taught by Ninian at Lancaster at one point. Yeah, extraordinary figure. I mean, my formation is very, very different in that, I mean, I still feel somewhat awkward at times about even thinking of myself as a theologian, and I find it comedic that I'm included in this book list of the world's leading Christian thinkers, because in part I think of myself much more as a literary theorist, as someone who's been formed as a philosopher, in terms of and I came to faith relatively late in life. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I came to faith, and it was at that point that I think that all of those big philosophical thinkers, some of whom come from the feminist school, the Judith Butlers, but also those sort of classic Western philosophers like Kant and Hegel. I started to read them with a theologian's eyes. My little book has an appendix, and it says, "A short and absurdly self-indulgent list of my parents." And in addition to mentioning my actual parents, yes, Shirley and Jeff, it has a list of some key figures who've really shaped me, from Marjorie Kemp, Gillian Rose, Dorothy L. Sayers, yes, the French postmodernists, Rowan Williams, of course, and I really am. I'm a very eclectic sort of thinker, and I'm a bit of a magpie, and I draw from all sorts of traditions. So I think, Virginia, that gives you a flavor of just how bewildered and confused I am as a theological thinker.
Well, I think eclecticism is a really wonderful way to look at the world, and I think I'm not surprised knowing that you're a poet as well, because I think it fits with the poetry. And I think I mentioned earlier on that we've had some other poets in this series before, and I think there's an interesting thing. Maybe we'll get when we talk about art at the end. Maybe we can come back to that. So moving on a little bit, I'm going to dive into a little bit more about your personal theologies. And again, I can sort of see some connections between them, but it doesn't sound like that when you start off looking at it, because Rachel, you've got a very unusual title for your book. It's called Specters of God, and your theology is based around the idea of spectres, which is quite an unusual approach for a Christian, perhaps not for a poet, but for a Christian, I think particularly in some churches, the idea of spectres and ghosts and ghouls is all a little bit suspect and perhaps not somewhere where we would go. But I think it's a very interesting approach. So can you tell us what you mean by it and why you chose that approach?
I think in part it reflects, again, some of my pre-Christian formation. There's a very famous philosophical book by Jacques Derrida called Spectres of God, which I won't bore you with, but it has in that a key concept that's become really quite important to me, is the notion of hauntology, sort of the sense in which we are haunted by cultural ideas. And I think that, to get to the nub of it, Specters of God, what I'm trying to get at here is, for me, as someone who is a fully paid up Christian, as someone who is a person of faith, who has a very strong sense of a personal relationship with God, nonetheless, there is a sense in which God, Jesus, the church, they're kind of spectral presences in our culture now. I mean, for the vast majority of people, they're at best, they're indifferent. At worst, they think of God, Christianity, church as toxic. And yet there is a sense in which just at the moment, we think we escape from references to faith. They come back. I mean, even tonight, our glorious leader, our beloved Prime Minister's chief strategist has resigned and deployed biblical language in doing so. And there's this sense in which the spectral the spectral presence of God is unavoidable. And I want to say, actually, that becomes a place of promise and hope. And why spectre? Well, because this isn't simply about, we're not talking about ghosts that might haunt country houses. We're talking about material, in other words, actual effective concepts that shape and continue to shape our society, pull it out of shape sometimes, have impacts on bodies, on ideas about love, on our understanding of time and reality, how we perform ourselves and how we are in the world. So spectres, I appreciate there is something perhaps a little bit disconcerting for perhaps more reformed Christians, but this sense of God as this presence in a society which no longer wants him, her, them, and yet she, they, him, it will not go away, is extraordinary for me.
I think that's really fascinating, and I think you've explained it really beautifully. And yeah, I loved wrestling with that and understanding and reading that. So I really commend your book, and I also commend Anne's book, because I think you're taking a different approach to theology. You talk in your book about serendipity, and your book is called The Serendipity of Life's Encounters, and you talk about how that has formed your theology, taken your theology to have different approaches. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that and what those serendipitous encounters were, and how your theology is multifaceted.
Yes, can I just say to begin with, I mean, I share Rachel's hesitancy about describing myself as a theologian. I think it tends to set up expectations that I'm not going to fulfill the people, for one thing. And I also share her inclination to scavenge around for all kinds of resources I mean, you know, there's a sort of academic core, but then there are all sorts of resources for theology that may be quite surprising for people. It happens to be literature and poetry for me, and music in particular, and so on. Dance is another phase. If you're going to talk about bodies, it's extraordinary the way Christian tradition has completely ignored whole dimensions of what it is to celebrate being human, which dance in its many forms is one. But that apart, yes, because Alec was my tutor and he taught a course called, well, it was a course on Anselm, Aquinas, Hume and Kant, believe it or not, and we all read the text. So I got hooked, partly because he was teaching it, of course, but partly because I simply got hooked on, you know, that sort of way of doing theology. If you take Anselm, for example, the way in which he integrates prayer with his very sophisticated thinking. At the end of the day, of the four, I'd side with Kant. In many ways, I could explain why. You might be amused to know, though, that one of my friends recently packed in a job in the United States because the dean of the then institution he was teaching told the students that they ought to stop reading and attending to the work of dead white European males. So, you know, that can cheer us all on. But very important for me at university was, I mean, I obviously picked up a lot from school rather than from the unbelievably dreary black Anglicanism that was available just down the road. You know, we had prayers at school, we all took turns to read scripture and so on. But when I got to university, what became increasingly important to me was the fact that the department, in effect, was right next door to the cathedral. And I agree with Rachel's sense that, you know, God and the church is a kind of spectre for many people. It isn't if you happen to be or to become part of one of those, an institution like Durham Cathedral, which admittedly was, you know, overtakes a previous northern saint, but houses him, and was put up by the marauders who built cathedrals all over the place. But it is also the case that a lot of people do flood in and out of these places, particularly for something like Sung Evensong, and where music helps to make worship possible, helps to make sense of sacramental life. There's other sort of traces of what we might think of the presence of God. So that was very important and enormously supportive to me personally. If you come from a kind of semi-bereft family, the way I happen to do, to be part of a place, however tangentially to begin with, where you know people have worshipped God and celebrated the presence of God and made the presence of God in a way possible for, you know, 900 or more years. And that gives you a different home, if you like, and a different kind of confidence in terms of which you can, you know, start to negotiate the world. But I'm very unsystematic in my theology. I don't think I've been easily fitted into any clear academic context. And as you'll see if I read my text, if somebody wrote to me and said, would you like to come and do a lecture on X? I mean, I always said yes, you know, whatever it was. I just said yes, looked at the title, scavenged about, thought hard, went and performed it, you know, and learnt from the audience that I was addressing. Thank you.
That's really lovely, and I like the fact you're open to sort of say, you know, the audience can teach you as well, and that it's a sort of two-way process. That's a really lovely approach.
Essential, yeah.
But again, it kind of fits with what DLT are trying to do with this series of making theology accessible. So just moving on, I mean, I think one of the things I really admire about you is you're one of the first female theologians in the country, in the UK, and you know, becoming a female theologian in the 60s is quite a thing, really. And I think for my generation, I'm the generation that comes after, we reap the benefit of women like you sort of ploughing a furrow. So it's not surprising to me that gender plays a big part of your work. And I just wondered, what does a theology of gender look like to you, and how your experiences have formed your views? How hard has it been to be a female academic theologian?
Female academic theologian, pretty painful at times. And but I think I had a fairly strong instinct for survival. I mean, I had to earn my living. I needed money to put a roof over my head. So there weren't all that many options, given that I was on some sort of theological track. Gender in my day, I mean, I'm so old that the sense of gender is very limited in comparison with the way that people engage in gender studies now. The old-fashioned distinction used to be between sex, the hormones and the biological kit that you happen to be born with, more or less clear for most of us probably. And gender was about what any particular society or culture made of it. More particularly, of course, as far as the churches were concerned, the theology was concerned. And the problem was women. Quite clearly, the females stroppy and difficult and so on. And I got into gender in various ways. One was an invitation from the Scott Holland Trust to give some lectures, give the Scott Holland lectures on theology and the significance of gender, which nobody had done before in the UK. So that was another example of, go away, find a library, find out what it was all about, and I don't know, just sort of perform it, do it. Lunchtime lecture at University, and two other formative experiences. One was I was the first person to be invited to lecture on sexual abuse to a gathering, what turned out to be women in York Minster's premises. It was an extraordinary occasion. I hadn't got the first idea what I was walking into, of course, but they had one and all been abused in one way, either verbally or physically, by clergy of any or all denomination. So that was a pretty hairy experience. I mean, talk about learning from an audience, yes. And another was, I was asked to do something called the John Coffin Lecture about the sexual abuse of children. And again, I looked that up and got out there and did it. And that precipitated a most extraordinary experience, because partway through the lecture, there was a woman at the back of the auditorium, which is the Senate House in London for those lectures, who started whooping with hysteria. So in the middle of the lecture, I had to stop and say, would somebody please get up, go out, find this lady, find out what's happening to her. And of course, it turned out that she'd been abused at some point in her life. And I was, as the speaker on this particular occasion, I was triggering all kinds of recollections and the legacy of this abuse in her. And I have since then got very, very cross with people who say, oh, we didn't think like that then, we didn't know about it. I mean, why the hell didn't they know? I mean, we have this astonishing capacity as human beings to turn a blind eye to things or to block it out even when it's stuck under our noses. If I'm thinking about gender now, of course, I would think in terms of the quite unequivocal affirmation of the full personal human dignity of every single person. I don't care where they come from or what shape or size they are or what their preferences are. And that has to be the bedrock of one's address to them and interaction with them, by which I don't mean to say that anything goes either. And then I think we have a lot of thinking and talking to do, not least still in the churches, about what gender adds up to in our society. And of course, at the moment, it's hugely controversial for all sorts of excellent reasons. So it should be.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting, and I think you know, it's interesting the spread of there's the point about women in society in the time you were growing in theology, and the links to abuse and how often that has been on women or children, and then that kind of links a little bit to the body, which is where I'm going to come to Rachel. Which is that in your book you talk about, one of your chapters is on the spectre of the body, and so linking to what's alluding to kind of what Anne's talked about kind of you know, the male body is the preferred body, and you also go further, Rachel, and you say it's male, white and whole. So how does that image of the body damage us, and how can we create a different vision of the body? To link a bit to what Anne says, is that gender is about everybody being treated equally.
Well, I think the first thing I want to say is that it's not an unreasonable reaction from many people, and I referenced this at the start of that chapter, to say, well, come on, the body, that's not spectral, you know. As a friend of mine at university would do, you know, when faced with skepticism about the body, would sort of, you know, bash their arm or their chest or something to say, look, it's solid. What I think I'm trying to get at is that we are never merely physical bodies. We live our bodies through all sorts of representations, ideas, images that are internalized and drive us and lead us. And quite often it takes an enormous amount of work to begin to see the way in which certain kinds of bodies, many of which are internalized, are really pernicious for us. And my sense is that certainly in a privileged nation like the UK, the body which is seen as the best, or the normal body is male, white, heterosexual, cisgendered, and we all live, all of us, however we identify, whoever we were assigned to be at birth, we all live in the shadow of that body, and that body has all sorts of religious dimensions to it as well. I'm not a great historian, but it seems to me that across and through time, it has generally been the case that any person that falls short of this ideal representation tends to get othered and pushed aside or treated as suspicious. And sorry, I forget the second part of your question here, Virginia, but I just think that there's something deeply troubling about that. But also we have to be honest about it and recognize the way in which this kind of idealized body has pernicious impacts on us. I mean, in the book, I speak very specifically about my experience of being an ill body and a disabled body. I could talk about being a trans body, for, you know, but as an ill body, that sense of the gap between who I think I ought to be, and actually who I ought to be isn't just simply a matter of what our secular society says, but has all sorts of religious connotations attached to it. It really does. You know, this sort of sense of, well, you know, if you're a good person, then you wouldn't be ill. Or what does the healed body even mean? And people draw out all sorts of curious readings of the Bible on that. So, and yet the body seems to me the great place of promise. I mean, not only is it the theatre of our lives in community and alone, it's just this extraordinary encounter with limit, with promise, you know, that sense of I'm alive and this world is so wondrous, and yet, gosh, I'm dying as well. But in the midst of that body is this invitation to be part of God's body, the body of Christ. And at the heart of that are ideas, images, representations of the body of Christ that subvert and queer this kind of obsession with the perfect, healthy, white, male, cis, het body, because Jesus's body is not that kind of body. I mean, even, you know, I try to be really biblical in my theology in one sense. You know, I want to go with what I find in the Gospels, and then I want to see how that unfolds in tradition and how that unfolds in my own life story. And the Christ we encounter in the scriptures, in the incarnation, is a Christ who is not, yes, is male, is coded as male, but his privilege is relatively limited. He's not a representative of the imperial powers, and his death is a criminal death. His body becomes pierced, and even and this is the key thing, you know, starting from that, going back to the resurrection, the resurrected body is this body which is pierced and has been shattered, and in resurrection does not become some sort of Greek god's body, but one which bears wounds and marks and scars through all time. And I think there's just some profound solidarity there. That particular body somehow speaks to my particular body and other particular bodies that are different from any kind of, I don't know, fantastical norm of who we should be. And I find that very exciting and hopeful.
Yeah, and I do too, and I think that's one of the passages in your book that I really loved. And I just want to bring you back in, Anne, because you mentioned it earlier on that theology doesn't tend to talk about bodies much, and the church has tended to avoid it. So I just wondered if you had any comments to make on that.
Well, I mean, a key area for me would be the area of dance, and as far as I know, I'm the only theologian, certainly in the UK, who's actually written an essay about the importance of attending to what has happened to dancers and dancers in the 20th and the 21st century. I mean, it is completely different from anything we've ever seen before as a phenomenon. I mean, the athleticism, the sheer physical beauty, the willingness to go places where a lot of us would rather not go, the way it transcends, in a way, dancers transcend time and space. If you want an image of a resurrected body, watch somebody jump, you know, and fill the stage with exuberance and delight and all the rest of it. And that for me ties up with something to do with sacramentality and the, you know, you asked about gender, you know, unequivocal affirmation of the human dignity of each person. It's not just the human dignity expressed in a face, it is the human dignity expressed in every inch, you know, of who and what we are and what our capacities and capabilities are. And if there's a resurrection life, I mean, please God, let it be more of it. Whatever the limitations, or in fact the experiences we may have of all of that, even as spectators. But there's something there that I think is very, very important, and a lot that can be learned about gender there too. If you want to, people bursting out through categories of what can and can't be done, or get on stage somewhere and, you know, find out how people in the theatre do it, not just others.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And as you were talking, I was just really reminded, because I think it linked to what Rachel was talking about, the kind of wounded body of the dance troupe that were in Britain's Got Talent. I think they're called Diversity, who did that fantastic Black Lives Matters dance last year. And it caused a lot of, some people didn't like it at all, but I thought it was one of the most powerful bit of movement, what you could do with your body, but how you could say something really,
Yes.
really deep and truthful about society,
Yes.
which also links to kind of the message of Christ.
Yes. Well, one of the key movers and shakers in all this, as far if you're going to think whatever black means, you know, whatever, was Alvin Ailey, you know, someone who came from nowhere, and lots of people now have seen the Alvin Ailey troupe. I mean, he's dead now, but you know, his work goes on, and absolutely shattering a piece called Revelation, which is about the emancipation from slavery, and which is actually danced to slave spirituals and all kinds of music and so on. And usually a performance of that, it's usually their signature piece, you know, that they do at the end of a performance, usually brings an audience to their feet and has them screaming and cheering and all the rest of it. And that's another real expression of, I think, how you can recognize and in a way inhabit, you know, through your imagination, your engagement with something that's supremely important, as, you know, another example with the piece you were mentioning.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going back to you, Rachel, and another area you were talking about in your book was about love, and you kind of point out, and I think this is true of all of us as Christians, how we readily speak of love but cannot model it. And I think that that's quite a challenge to read. And you know, we can always point the finger at those other people who say they're Christians and don't know that, but it's a challenge for us as well, because it's true of all of us. But I just wanted to kind of ask, you know, why is it's so difficult for us to model love, and how can understanding Christ's bodily function, suffering that you talked about, how can that help us overcome our limitations to love?
Gosh, yes. Why is it such a struggle? I mean, I think partly as Christians, quite often, and I guess when I say as Christians, gosh, that was a terrible generalization. I'm just going to own it for myself here. I think quite often I am not prepared to foreground my own power enough. You know, too often I will deploy something, a word like love, which has all sorts of different kinds of horizons, and it's been fetishized in our society. You know, it's become held up in such a way that it's very difficult to treat with. But I'm very conscious that, given arguably love is the abiding / central virtue of Christianity, as soon as you make something central, it's very difficult to see beyond it or see around it. And when love, as it inevitably does when we are humans in a community, gets taken through the prism of power, then it becomes very, very difficult to genuinely recognize the full complexity of the community. I mean, another way of putting it is, whoever's in charge of a community will tend to tell you what love looks like. And communities, I mean, it's a starting point for me. I mean, Christianity is about community first and the individual second, but inevitably it loses sight of who's at the edge and who's beyond the edge. There's a beautiful word which I've learned in the last couple of years, ecotone, and this is the kind of middle ground between ecological zones, and it's almost like the scrubland of the soul. It's the scrubland of our identities, and it's where new things are happening and springing up, and sometimes are breaking in to this ecology of love, or these sort of Christian ecologies of faith. But we've become terrified by them because, gosh, they're going to disrupt them. And I'm very conscious of how easy it is for me to position myself as, oh, you know, I'm an edge land person. I'm a person of the edge because I'm queer, or I'm this, or I'm that. And yet I'm not being attentive still to the way in which God is escaping my longing to pin him, her, them down. You know, this is the thing, you know, the work of the Spirit for me, and in the chapter on love, I talk very much about the Spirit. The work of the Spirit for me is this work of disruption, of pushing us out of shape. And the work of the Spirit is always to draw attention to that sense in which we could become better modelers of love, better people who represent love in our bodies more fully. And yet we kind of want to put God in a box. We want to put the Spirit in a cage and say, and now will you just please stay there? And of course, because the Christian God is a resurrection God, Jesus's body won't stay still. You know, the Spirit escapes, slides through the trap. The body, which we say now, just stay down, you're dead. Or will you please just be this particular kind of God? God says, I'm about my business elsewhere. The Spirit will blow where she will. God's body will resurrect where he must. And that's so disruptive. And for me, and again, I'm very, very, you know, very much focused on Jesus Christ. And I keep wanting to go back and back and back to this potential within me to crucify God, which is the potential at the heart of the Christian community. You know, and who crucified Jesus? Well, we did. You know, it wasn't them over there who did it, we did. And so what is going on in the midst of that? And it's a kind of invitation into compassion, you know, which just means suffer with. But we have to do that in a kind of absolute solidarity with those bodies who are being crucified. So yeah, I feel like I'm just rambling, Virginia, but hopefully I'm sort of gesturing towards some kind of profound, there's a mystery at the heart of love. The moment we think we've got love sorted and in order, love breaks free, and invites us to go with her.
And I think you weren't rambling at all. I think that was really very helpful. And before I just go back to you, Anne, with a question that kind of links to what we've just been talking about, just a reminder to everyone in the audience, please do give Will your sort of questions so we have a bit of time for questions at the end. So if you've got questions that are forming, please write them in the chat, and Will pass them on to me, and we'll pass them to Anne and Rachel. So, I mean, I think what Rachel was just talking there about, the fact that we are all part of the crucifixion of Christ, and that you know, Christ breaks out of that, and Jesus breaks out of that. But there is also the suffering that happens with Jesus, and we talk, and you, I think you mentioned in your book about sort of suffering, and most of the suffering in the world is caused by evil, and it is our own evil often, but it's evil of others. But you talk about the importance of theodicy, the belief in divine intervention in the face of evil, and I just wondered how understanding this kind of philosophy can help us navigate a world that feels very cruel at the moment, and kind of take that challenge that Rachel set us of not breaking free of the crucifixion, not being the ones to crucify, but being the ones to be standing compassionate with.
Yeah, well, I don't like the phrase divine intervention, and I think that's a huge mistake. You know, nobody's going to zap in and sort things out for us. And I think in order to understand what we need to do nowadays in particular is draw on everything we can grasp about the vastness of the universe, an amazing, wonderful, extraordinary universe in which our planet is situated, which in itself is you know, if you remember the great images of it from space, is a jewel and a gift, and in which we and all sorts of other unimaginable and unimaginable creatures are in effect enabled to make ourselves. And of course, some of that is comfortable for us, some of it is most emphatically not comfortable for us. I mean, think ghastly viruses with names of one kind or another. But equally, of course, we have this extraordinary capacity nowadays, at any rate, to do something about some of this. And you might even want to say that, if you want to see what the spirit is like, think of the people in the laboratories who, worked out the vaccines and so on. They may give us sort of clues to the life of the spirit. But I think it's very difficult for us at the moment. I mean, we used to think there was events called natural disasters, acts of God, or worst of all, Mother Nature, wreaking havoc all over the place. And what we've now come to realize, I think, or are coming to realize very, very painfully, is that actually we're responsible for a lot of the damage. So we have an appalling effect, not just on ourselves as human beings, but on other creatures in all sorts of other contexts. And yet, there's always this hope, this vitality, this appeal to the possibility that things don't have to be like this, and they can be very much better. But on the as far as the sheer practicalities of things are concerned, I entirely agree that the spirit can erupt all over the place. But I mean, there are absolutely rock bottom, bone simple things, like making damn sure that nobody lives homelessly, nobody has to go to a food bank, people have access to the care that they need, and these are political and social and profoundly matters of theological importance. It's not just palliative, it ought to be transformative. And of course, it will have to keep on going. It will take on different forms at different times. And as we engage with all that, I think that's, if you want to use the language of divine presence, if not a divine intervention, I think it's in those kinds of activities that we might, be prepared to use the word God or the Spirit or whatever, with great caution, without flattering ourselves. And I think one of the other manifestations of love is praise and thankfulness, the sense of the world as a gift. I mean, Christian churches go on about adoring God or worshipping God. We sing a Gloria maybe at the end of a psalm or whatever it all is. You can't do that actually unless you're in the habit, for example, of saying grace before meals, of congratulating people, of praising them, of building their confidence and so on. So there are all sorts of things that the Spirit can move us to do, which are well within our competence, I think, as well as all the things that we haven't the faintest idea whether we're capable of doing. So,
Thank you. That was a lovely answer, and I think that also connects to my final question for Rachel, and then I'll have a final one for Anne, and then I hope people from the audience will have some questions. And it was really interesting that you touched on kind of climate change and climate disaster, because that comes into your third chapter, Rachel, and I was really struck by your description of climate change has happened, is happening, will be happening, and the link that you make with God's time and the mystery of the third day of the resurrection. And so I just wonder about how your ideas of the third day and God's time, how can it help us navigate the world, particularly with climate anxiety and fears of the future? How can that be of assistance to us?
Yeah, sure. And I wonder if I could possibly read a short section from the book as part of my answer. But I think in essence, what I'm trying to get at with saying that the spectre of God's time is to say that is to assert that if we begin on the third day, if we say that the third day is the starting point, then it is a fundamental critique of consumerist capitalist time, which says that we can never be full, that we are never satisfied, that the water will never become wine, that says that all we can know is desire, and that time just goes in one direction. Whereas to start on the third day with the resurrection of Jesus Christ, with the raising of Lazarus, with the water into wine, those third day moments in John's gospel, is to say, actually, time and reality are not to be read on those terms, but it is a reminder that we are always caught up in revelation. We are always caught up in the dying of a world and the rebirth of a world. And that, you know, that could sound like just a bit of fancy Dan mysticism. So I think I'll read this. What I want to say is, words are not adequate to the word. Our metaphors, our similes, our sentences and poetry and novelizing and word making fall short of the language of God. Her verbs, nouns and adjectives, metaphors and similes, of her subjunctive moods and conditionals, and of the whole excessive, strange and abundant language of God. In the end, as one seeks to be cataphatic, that is to find positive ways to talk about the wonder of the living God, one ends up in the apophatic, the way of unknowing and the way beyond. One ends in silence. The facts of God and the promise of God totally fry our brains. As we encounter God, we are undone. She has passed by in the pillar of cloud and leaves us slack-jawed, haunted and dazed. Is this vision of God's overwhelming, haunting power a recipe for quietism? For some, maybe. A kind of quietism might be just what is required. There are times when I need to acknowledge who and what I am in the grand expanse of God's universe. In being humbled lies the promise of the begin again. To treat with such an excessive God is an opportunity to divest pretension. In humility, one may be enabled to see the other as neighbor and act on it. Such encounters will be for some of us the bonfire of doctrines and positions we deploy to make us feel safe or better or more righteous. For some of us, a version of God or Jesus or the Spirit that really needed to die will die. Those versions may continue to haunt us, and it will take the risen living God to show them up for the shades they are. I know that speaking of time and God in spectral terms might barely seem to address pressing matters of politics and ethics, of how one might act in a world where economic and social futures seem or foreclosed, either as a result of climate change or totalizing ideologies. I am more hopeful to embrace in all its outrageous oddness the third day as the turning point of the world will always be a moment of disruption. It is always a crisis point. It is, for those with more politically and socially charged minds and bodies than mine, a moment for both a new vision and the possibility of a richer politics. To confront a world coming to an end with the gift of God, who is world without end, might yet be a moment when poetics transforms politics. And so much of our failures, and my failures and all our failures, is we just aren't prepared to imagine. We aren't prepared to let the word just bust open our words and show us a new way.
That is a very beautiful way. I mean, I love John's gospel, and I love the way you explain that and bring the word to life in that way. And I think the key thing I'm taking from the last sentence is imagination, because I think that again very much links to my last question to Anne, which, and again, it is a theme that's gone through many of these talks about the importance of art and thinking about theology. And we've talked about the cosmos, we've talked about poetry, we talked about music. You mentioned dance earlier on, Anne. So how does the theology of art help us provide that hope and sustenance that we really desperately need at the moment, and help us break the world open in the way that Rachel's just described?
Well, just let me pick up one thing from Rachel and from your response to us. One of the problems at the moment is our ignorance of St. John's Gospel because of the way the lectionaries are being concocted. And I can honestly and truthfully say that never in the whole of my life have I heard a sermon on John chapter 11 of the raising of Lazarus. And, you know, there are serious questions about how we are enabled to do what needs to be done by immersion in and repeated engagement with some of this stuff, this third day theme that Rachel so beautifully expounded, and its possible consequences. You won't be surprised to know that I think there have to be the arts. There's no such single theology of art. I think it's always going to be multiple, partly because the arts are multiple, and we needn't have too high and mighty a view of the arts. Some people are staggeringly talented, as Rachel manifestly is in her poetry. But I mean, if you think of art as poesis, as just making, and go back to the theme of praise and gratitude and all the rest of it, I mean, but nearly all of us are artists to one degree or another. You know, whether it's cooking or cleaning or changing somebody's shoes or whatever it is. Of course, there are the arts in the sense of, you know, the Raphael that hangs on the wall and so on. But I think that it's about human making in all its extraordinary, wonderful varieties, whether it's sophisticated or extraordinarily simple. Most things actually aren't as simple as they appear, for which we need to praise, be articulate about, and be profoundly grateful for, instead of thinking of art as something that's, you know, really very, very specialized and only for the few.
Thank you. I started talking and I hadn't muted. Thank you very much for that. I entirely endorse the art is not the rarefied thing. It is, and I love the idea of art being cleaning and cooking and all those simple things that don't get a look in usually. So thank you very much to both of you for really, really interesting answers to my questions. I'm going to move on to, we have got some from the audience, so I'll start with those. And the first one we have is from Martha, and it's question, I'll go to Anne first, then Rachel. And if there was a book or two or three that was formative in your theological thinking, what would that be? So Anne first.
A particular book. Well, it sounds very peculiar and very academic. Immanuel Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, because one of the things that I learned from that, I mean, Kant has a very at one level obvious but very severe understanding of God. God is creator, lawgiver and judge. Where we meet God is as judge in the first instance. And what he's trying to get at, I think, is, you know, what matters in a way is what we do with who we are and what we're confronted with. If that doesn't sort of brace us up, it seems to me that nothing else will, really.
Thank you. You should have seen Rachel's, I don't know if you saw Rachel's reaction, she went like that when you said Kant, so so obviously it's popular with
most people don't use it, never get that far. I mean, they need a bowdlerized version of Kant on the arguments of God from the first critique, and they don't read the short essays and so on of the 1790s, and that have profound importance, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, Rachel, what would your answer to that question be?
Gosh, I mean, just to say on the matter of Kant, I mean, I have to say I spent much more time with the Critique of Pure Reason, and I am convinced that there was a single day in probably about May 1993, middle of May 1993, when I think I understood what Kant was saying in the critique. That's Pure Reason. I'm just being naughty and silly. I think I could talk about some mighty tomes, but I think a really important book for me, very soon after I came to faith, and I think it's fair to say that when I came to faith, I was just utterly bewildered and confused, not least about whether I, as a reasonably bright, academic-y, scholarish sort of person, could use my brain as a Christian. And I know that sounds a probably stupid thing to say, but that's how I felt when I came to faith in my mid-20s. And I was given a book, just Letters and Papers from Prison, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison, which had a huge impact on me, in that I felt that I was involved in, I was participating in an extraordinary human being's encounter with evil, with human caprice and selfishness, and constantly searching to find some way of articulating who God is for Bonhoeffer in, I mean, truly extraordinary and terrifying times. And somehow, you know, whilst it doesn't feel like a terribly important book to me now in the way that it was then, it enabled me to find the connective tissue between being a person who searches, and I want to be a searcher, I want to be someone who's not easily satisfied, and yet who's seeking after trust in the living God. So it's just a very, very powerful book for me. And I'd recommend it to anyone, actually. It's probably very dated in its language now, but this terrific brain, writing to family and his friend Eberhard Bethger, it's an extraordinary encounter with someone asking, what does it mean to speak of God in such a time as this?
Thank you. Those are both very, very good recommendations. Yeah, thank you both for those. So, and thank you, Martha, for the question. So we've got a second question from Martin Clay. And I think it's quite a long question. So if you need me to repeat it, I can repeat it. And I'll go to you, Rachel, since you're on my screen at the moment. How do the speakers see the Church's solution to gender difference as being to eliminate gender, so as to admit women as priests, and the resistance to gender identity as being focused on denying gender and affirming biology? They are symmetrical, but seem to require a view of humanity as gender-free. So, Rachel, can you have a think about that?
Gosh, I mean, I think I could take more time unpicking the question than I might trying to find an answer. I think my instinct is to say, yes, talk of gender, talk of sex, talk of identity is messy and complex, but actually all of the resources are already there. Yeah, and we just don't need to panic about it, actually, because, you know, I mean, just to give you one simple example, just putting questions around sex, sexuality, gender, identity in a theological, historical perspective, there are some pretty strong arguments, I think, for suggesting that, for example, in Christian thinking, wasn't until 17th, maybe the 18th century, that really there was an emergent two-sex theory about human beings anyway. Now you might think that's insane. How, if I'm allowed to say that word anymore, you know, that is wild. How can you say that when you just need to pick up the Bible and it says men and women? My point being is that such was the power of a certain Aristotelian understanding of human being, that women were coded as failed men. Yeah. Now, you know, that language, you know, that is an understanding of it. Well, it shows how our understandings of sex, sexuality, gender are emergent over time, you know, that they're contingent and they're complex and messy. And I don't find that terrifying or scary. What I find scary is when, as a church, we buy into a rather crude scientism or a crude modern conception of modernity.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. Anne?
Yes, I mean, I think the default position of the Western Church, at any rate, has been that women are necessarily subordinate to men because they are inferior to them. And this is mixed up with all sorts of now superseded gynecology and understanding of the human body, which still lurks around. I was a member of the Church of England's Working Party on women in the episcopate, right? And there were some extraordinary things going on in the discussion. One thing I came to conclude was that despite all the different doctrinal differences between all sorts of ecclesial groups, the one thing that united them was extreme discomfort about women and who women were and what they represented. And if you want a phrase that I lobbed into the one and only thing I ever wrote about the experience of being on the committee, I mean, I think the basic one way of putting it is that the classical view of women in Christianity, in the West at any rate, was that they were intermittently bleeding half-wits. I offer that to you as for your entertainment. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to, and that is, of course, completely unacceptable.
Thank you. I think that's a very, very good note to end on. I would really like to just thank both Rachel and Anne for your really wonderful insights and the connection between your work and the challenges you've given us tonight. It's been really wonderful to listen to you. I'm going to hand you back to Will, who can just kind of round up to sort of remind us about the other wonderful books in this series. But please do get Rachel's Spectres of God and Anne's The Serendipity of Life's Encounters. They're both wonderful books and really good read, and really challenge my theological thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Virginia, for sharing the discussion, and of course to Rachel and Anne for sharing their valuable insight, inspiration and theology this evening. And thank you for your audience questions and for joining us tonight. Much appreciated. There are 15 books in the My Theology series. There are 11 out now, with 4 to come in March. Other authors in the series include Malcolm Guite, Alistair McGrath, Ilya Delio, Robert Beckford, Joan Chittister, there's a really great sort of mix, I think. Both Rachel and Anne's My Theology books are available now in pocket-sized paperback and also ebook as well, online and from all good bookstores. Rachel's is My Theology, Specters of God, and Anne's is My Theology, The Serendipity of Life's Encounters. So all that remains to say is thank you once again, Rachel and Anne and Virginia, and to all of you for coming, and have a good rest of the evening and take care.